welcome to the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action. Before we begin this afternoon's parallel session, we have a few reminders. Kindly ensure that your audio is on mute while our experts are discussing. Please feel free to turn on your videos if you please to do so. We will also be having a question and answer session after the discussion. This parallel session is brought to you by our official conference partner, CIFAL Jeju. And the topic that we will be discussing is on social protection of migrants experiencing climate risks. I would like to introduce to you Ms. Wajin Kim, the Senior Program Officer for CIFAL Jeju, who will serve as our moderator for this session. Ms. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ariane, and welcome to the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action. This conference is organized by University of Philippines or UNITAR CIFAL Philippines to provide a venue for discourse and exploration of how leaders, communities, and agencies could respond to the complex challenge of climate change and human mobility nexus, and also try to find our ways forward. Currently, you are joining in a parallel session on social protection of migrants experiencing climate risks hosted by UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. Good afternoon from Jeju and good morning for some of you. My name is Hwajin Kim and I'll be your facilitator today. The topic of today's discussion is climate risks and social protection. In fact, climate vulnerable groups and the human rights in relation to climate change response and adaptation were clearly stated in the 2015 Paris Agreement. When 1 billion people out of 7 billion global population moved within or outside of their country of origin in 2020, it is comparative we talk about all dimensions of international migration in taking actions to combat climate change and its impact. So today, for the next 1 hour, we will first talk with Ms. Angelica on the issue of climate vulnerable groups. And then we will explore social protection of migrants experiencing climate risks with Dr. Nambi Appadurai. He currently serves as Director and Strategy Head of Climate Resilience Practice of World Resources Institute of India. As most of his research work is focused on community-based resilience practice in the Asian and African context, I believe we will have an opportunity today to hear community-level climate resilience and protective measures to avoid climate risks. Now, I would like to open the session by inviting Director Hong-gi Choi of CIFAL Jeju. Director Choi was a career diplomat serving in Turkey and Jordan before joining in as a director to UNITAR CIFAL Jeju. Now, Director Choi, the floor is yours.
Dear distinguished speaker and our participants, good afternoon from Jeju. My name is Hong-gi Choi, Director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju International Training Center. Let me first warmly welcome all of you to this webinar, Social Protection of Migrants Experiencing Climate Risk. As introduced, this session is organized as a parallel session of the International Conference on Human Mobility and Climate Action organized by the CIFAL Philippines. As a partner center under the UNITAR umbrella in Asia and Pacific region, I would like to commend the efforts put together by University of Philippines and CIFAL Philippines team behind this event. Although Korea has not seen a serious level of climate migration domestically, it is reported that climate change and its complex factors are the main drivers of international migration. So today's session intends to raise awareness on the critical issue of building climate resilience and strengthening social protection. One way to build climate resilience is engaging with multi-stakeholders to learn, adapt innovative approaches, and reform administrative process to build capacity. By organizing an online conference such as this one, we can provide a venue to address a variety of issues related to migrants experiencing climate risks which is another way to build our society back for better. CIFAL Jeju, since 2010, has been providing capacity building support to local authorities in Asia and the Pacific region in environmental sustainability, social inclusion, and economic development. To further its efforts, CIFAL Jeju will continue to work with other centers in the Asia and the Pacific, including CIFAL Philippines, to build the capacity of national, local government, officials, and civil society in implementing the sustainable development goals. I hope this session will provide an opportunity for in-depth discussions, knowledge sharing, good practices, and lessons learned on innovative practice. I would like to thank our presenters for being here with us today, and I look forward to having a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Che. Let us begin with our background talk first. I'm sitting with here, Ms. Angelica Anyabesa. She was an elected local government official from the Philippines, and now she's studying in Korea. Well, the purpose of this talk is to help you connect the dots. You see, in Korea, in fact, we were fortunate enough to not experience major climate disasters. Of course, we are experiencing abnormal weather patterns, but that did not produce the so-called climate migrants. So to share a more realistic case, I invited her to share with us what the Philippines or Cebu City has done in case of climate disasters and what the city did for protecting the climate vulnerable groups. So I believe this background talk will help you feel the issue of climate vulnerable groups closer and therefore have a better understanding when you listen to the lecture of Dr. Nambi Apadurai that will follow. So Ms. Angelica Anyabesa, thank you for being with us today. Can you please introduce yourself first?
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is with us today. It is my honor to be here, and I would like to thank all the organizers for having me. By the way, I am Angelica Anyabesa. I am a youth local government official from Cebu, Philippines, and I've been an environmental protection advocate for over 8 years now. I've been doing all those initiatives back in my home country and in our local government. And currently, I am taking my master's degree program in Sungkyunkwan University here in South Korea.
Thank you very much again. So as I briefly said before, the purpose of this talk is to raise awareness on climate vulnerable groups and the need to have social protection for them. I believe you can share a real story with us. In this regard, can you walk us through what kind of climate disaster you have seen or experienced in the Philippines? And as a citizen, how did you respond to them?
Yeah, well, as we all know, Philippines is an archipelagic country composed of thousands of islands, including our province, which is Cebu. And, you know, the country is highly vulnerable and exposed to natural disasters. And as I grow up also in the coastal area, I have had firsthand experiences of those natural disasters, primarily storms. And, you know, after storms, there are actually flash floods, but living in the coastal area, you won't just have to look into one climate variable, but there are a lot or multiple climate variables that you need to consider. And it brings different effects and sometimes combined difficulties to the residents living to the coastal area that, for example, if there is a heavy rainfall and it is also high tide. So what happens, the sea level rises and it meets with the surface runoffs. So it creates a deep and like from knee to waist length flash flood. And in response, the community always gets flooded, and that's when they get displaced. And in response, they do renovations in their homes. But until now, that problem still exists. Mm-hmm. And it's not like forever they will be renovating their homes. So most of them are also being displaced by relocating and migrating.
Right. I mean, when it comes to climate vulnerables, we can think about those of low-income class, children, and women. But in the case of the Philippines, I guess migrants can also be included in the climate vulnerable groups. And how do you think about this?
Well, yeah, indeed, poor are not a homogeneous group. The impacts of climate change also bring different effects to different households and even like different members of a household. And that includes the children and women or even the men. And that what also happens to climate migrants. The case in the Philippines is that we don't have a concrete structure or framework that protects those migrants. And what happens, it makes their lives harder. Well, you know, if they migrate, relocating or having like housing assistance is just a short-term solution, but it provides another problem like educational assistance and livelihood, which they need for longer sustenance.
Can you perhaps share with us any specific case, like any climate disaster happen and how the society or the government respond to them in case of the vulnerable groups and migrants?
I see. Well, in my case, in our locality, we haven't really experienced like a totally disastrous natural disaster or storm. But what I can maybe give an example is what happened to Typhoon Haiyan back in 2013. So that happened in Tacloban, which is also a coastal community. And there were like 6 million people who got displaced and 12 million people like lost their jobs. But you know, after how many years, some people still live in tents. And like, for example, teenagers have another problem, like they don't have much security in themselves since they're just living all together with other people in those relocation sites. And children don't have access to proper education for how many years. That's what happened to climate migrants. And, you know, the government was able to respond to that. However, due to the lack of the structured or concrete structure or framework to help those affected families and people, still it's giving them more problems over time.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, when we talk about climate migrants, it can be international migrants, but it can also be internal migration, right? So in the case of the Philippines, I guess what you were just describing was internal migration of relocation. And you also mentioned that it's really difficult for the individuals or the groups of individuals to cope with the climate impact themselves. So it has to be the government or the society who has to take the responsibility, protect them by providing some concrete framework or system. But I understand when it comes to the policy, it's more often short-term than long-term.
Yes.
And when the government changes all the system and plans, sometimes reform. Yeah.
Yes.
So in this case, what difference do you think it can make if we have a better social protection? And because you are also serving the government, local government, what would you do as a government to better the situation?
Yeah. Well, I had like I read about how South Korea responded to address poverty and the lack of like livelihoods back in 1997. Well, in the case of the Philippines, it will really help if there are concrete social protection programs because it really reduces vulnerabilities. And, you know, these climate migrants really need assistance, especially like there are social protection not really protection programs, but there are like cash for aid programs that are existing in the Philippines, but it's not directly provided for those who are environmentally affected or like the climate migrants, as we say. And, you know, it really needs a concrete structure, like from top to bottom approach. The local government may be able to initiate projects as such, especially those that are really at risk with these natural disasters. But, you know, having a national framework would do a lot way better solution for all of the people, because the problem in the Philippines is that we are really at risk for how many years we've been part of like in the top 5 of being exposed from natural disasters. But what happens is we lack the social protection programs, which our people really need. And what we really need is really a national framework, as what the public aid system that South Korea has, which provide livelihood assistance, educational assistance, medical insurance assistance, and any other benefits that the low-income people can get. And that's what the country needs to do too.
Thank you very much. And can you also share, as a young student, a youth perspective on how the climate risks, how the climate vulnerable groups should be protected by the government?
Yes, so it is also a coincidence that my thesis is about resiliency, because I'm really into natural protection or environmental protection. So there is this approach into resiliency that people can bounce forward. Aside from bouncing back, they can also bounce forward by creating solutions for longer terms. And that's what the government can do. Even the local government units can initiate those projects. And especially, I am actually a youth representative in the Youth Council. I'm an acting SK chairperson for all of the Filipinos who can relate to my position. And in our level, we even have the environmental committee. And with just educating the people on how to be resilient and how to adapt to natural disasters, it can already make a great impact to them. And especially if we start from the youngsters and from the youth, they can provide like a greater impact over time, because they will have longer generation to follow.
Right, I cannot agree more than that with you. Thank you very much. And I believe this is all of what we have, like education, raising awareness. This is the essence of having this session with you. So I believe she provided a great background talk with you. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Appadurai. He will present social protection of migrants who experience climate risks. Dr. Appadurai, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizations which are involved in this process and inviting me here. It's such a pleasure to be here. I also want to confess I'm no expert in migration. I'm all along been a resilient practitioner, and I have some level of exposure to policy. So that's the background of my work, mostly looking at the governance side of it. With that background, I just want to kind of mention how important social protection today. Of late, particularly in the post-COVID era, this is much talked about topic, as because it has exposed the limitations of social protection in a larger way today than ever. So every country is grappling with the notion and how to kind of strengthen those things. And if at all, whatever COVID has done, it has really exposed the vulnerabilities of people, as well as the social protection, the lacunae in the protection measures. So with that note, I'll organize my talk in terms of, going into some of the basic stuff, the connections between climate change and migration, and then talk about a few examples of, how social protection measures are helping out and where do you go from here. That's the kind of order of the sequence of my talk. And then again, as I mentioned to you, it's a vast subject. There is no one solution. It is very context-driven kind of a subject. And we'll come back to some questions and stuff if there is any. And I'm also learning in this process. I'm no expert, as I mentioned. So let me go to the first slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the human mobility spectrum. What you see is there are different kinds of mobility. The predominant ones are migration, displacement, or relocation. Migration, just bear with me, some of them are stating the obvious, but still I feel it's important to establish a context here to understand that even if it is a cost of repetition, it is worth mentioning that because people should understand in a certain frame. So that's the reason I'm just going to kind of mention this. So there are three types of mobility. One is the migration, which might be longer term or shorter term, movements away from where we are, where we belong to, moving to other geographies for various reasons. And displacement, oftentimes it's forceful. Sometimes, for example, a typical example is a dam construction where people have moved from places, for a specific purpose. Any development programs will push you. So then that is displacement. And then relocation, particularly this is more climate driven these days for various reasons. Some again, development programs and initiatives might push this as well, but still, relocation is more looked in the context of, sea level rise and other things today, where the environmentally vulnerable places, people move to other places for some permanent settlement. And again, in terms of immobility, there are certain classes of people for various reasons stay put in certain places because they are so much attached to the culture, they are so much dependent on the resource base of that particular geography. And sometimes they get trapped as well, particularly the older ones and the disabled. They don't have the wherewithal to kind of, adjust to the realities, and, there are no help and so they get trapped. So that's the kind of spectrum what we're talking about. Next slide, please. So is it a new phenomenon? No. Are we rediscovering it? The movement of people, as from time immemorial, man has been moving from hunter-gatherer society. We've seen that, people have to move around for their livelihoods. And even today, there are across the globe, you see, there are so many nomadic peoples and pastoralists move. There are certain patterns also in terms of movement to secure their livelihoods. So this has been largely in response to changes in the environment, mostly seasonal, and it has been happening for many years. So there's nothing new about it. What is new is we are trying to let us more recognition about the linkages between and the implications that climate change and environment has on new human mobility. That has been widely studied today, and we are getting some insights out of it, all these kind of studies. There are numerous studies. Next slide, please. There are, particularly when the climate driven under the climate change context, there are 4 push factors, which is the intensification of natural disasters. As we know, the frequency and the intensity of storms and other natural disasters are on the up today. And it's quite naturally, people cannot adjust to only limited coping capacity we have. They have to naturally move out from the places where they've been living. And increased warming and drought that affects agriculture production and access to water, clean water. This is certainly the vulnerable communities are affected in a very big way. And this is another push factor. And more importantly, of late, we see sea level rise, particularly the coastal communities are affected in a very big way. Almost 44% of the world's population lives within the 150 kilometers of the coast today. And this is going to increase because the rapid urbanization which is taking place across the globe today. You see, there are, hectic movement in the coastal areas because, the livelihoods are very much woven with the realities of the coastal life. So we can't avoid that, and that's happening at a very rapid pace. Across the globe, we see this pattern. And competition of natural resources may lead to conflict in terms of displacement. That is a understood fact. Next, please. Again, there are wide range of studies, forget about the numbers. Different studies project different kinds of numbers, but what is important is there is an unanimous agreement that this is happening today. Climate change is there, and it is here to stay. So that has been really pushing people to move to different directions. So there are, for example, the ILO study, the most recent one, 2017 study shows estimates about 250 million migrants globally there, and out of which 40% being women. That is a very starking kind of a reality what you see there. And 164 million workers of the global labor pool are moving. And again, a World Bank study, 2018 study shows, in the regions of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, generate about 143 million more climate migrants by 2050. That is about 68.5 million people are forcibly displaced today because of climate events. Next slide, please. Again, another study, which is the Stern report, which is a most celebrated Stern report, finds out 1 in every 45 people in the world will have been displaced by climate change as early as 2030. That is really very starking reality. And one has to, again, these are numbers, there are, how do they arrive? That's a different question. There are different ways to estimate these things, but still the central message is that it is happening and people are moving at a very rapid pace from one place to another. And the push factor is the climate factor to a large extent. Not only the climate, again, there are other elements also. That's not, we cannot attribute everything to climate change. There are other, people seeking jobs, there are various reasons, families being, I've switched over some years back, they want to join the families. There are many reasons, but certainly of late, climate change seems to be one of the important critical factors which come into play. about 24 and 21.5 million people who flee their homes as a result of sudden onset weather hazards every year. And one thing what we have to notice here, there is a subtle difference between the extreme events and the slow onset events. Now, what gets projected is always the extreme events, because of the severity and it's very, sensational, and media also makes it sensational. And it's also, it's very visible, whereas the slow onset events are not visible, like a drought or other phenomena are not very visible, but it is a long-term effect. It is a very profound impact on people. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. And there are other observed trends as well associated with critical issues. There are, mostly it is because of the resource scarcity, people move, and it again attributed to weather extremes many times, and intensifying intra and interstate competition for food, water, and other resources. When people say that next world war is going to be fought on water, that's the kind of intensity what you see. Many of the well-placed countries are also starving today of water because of droughts and other natural phenomenon which is happening today, which lead to certain levels of migration as well as conflicts as well. We cannot forget that it also it results in bigger conflicts. Increased frequency and severity of disease outbreaks, that is also happening across the board, and also increased border stress, immense stress in the borders. A country like India, God knows what will happen. Bangladesh is going to really face already they are facing the wrath of natural disasters. If it is going at a high scale, it's going to really impact these countries. The transboundaries are very fragile today, and it is important to take care of these things. And move on. The next slide, please. So what are the drivers? There are two drivers. One is climate processes and also the climate events. Climate processes are, which mostly, which induces climate change. The disturbances, the disruptions are induced by the climate process, like sea level rise, salinization of agricultural land. Over a period of time, this community will be really facing lots of difficulties. We are seeing several examples across the globe, what's happening because of the inundation of the seawater intrusions in the productive agricultural lands, and desertification and growing water scarcity are also largely, you see that these are the processes driving mobility, as well as the climate events, which I talked about earlier, floods, storms, and glacial lake outbursts. These are very visible. So the floods are very visible. So it gets the good attention as well, because there are certain good rehabilitation measures and relief and rehabilitation measures which are there. So it is far more easier to handle those things. And we are also mastered this art over a period of time now. Still, there are certain lacunas and gaps. I'm not saying that every country is endowed with those resources to deal with this, but still there are inadequacies in capacities and stuff. We'll come back to that a little later. The degree of vulnerability people are experiencing more and more today. But the same kind of event, same intensity, but the number of people who are affected are far more today. Next, please. So again, the relationship between, the understanding of climate change itself is so difficult because, it is a very complex phenomenon, and coupled with migration, it's even more difficult for us to understand the underlying currents and factors. The scientific basis, as you all know, the IPCC's IR 6 report came recently, and then, unequivocally, they've established the relationship between the temperature, precipitation, sea level rise with the global warming, and also the impacts in different regions. What is special about this IPCC report is they've done in-depth analysis region-wise to continent-wise. Data is available today, and it is very clear that every sphere there is an impact across the continent. What we see there, and also there is a relationship is very unpredictable. The science of climate change, as I told, it's very complex, and let alone its impacts on societies at different resources and varied capacity to adapt. That's on top of it. Again, climate change is the third order vulnerabilities. There are other underlying vulnerabilities. What you see is, the population intensity, the growing population, as well as the poverty and other things. So it is a double whammy, if you would like to put it that way. And individual migrants' decision to leave their homes vary so widely as well. Again, there are several economic pull factors and also the environmental push factors. These are the two primarily identified factors which drives, today's migration to a largest extent. And even in the past, economic pull factors were there. People migrated, particularly when you see from people from migrating from Philippines to the US or India to US. They're not because of the vulnerabilities, mostly because of the lifestyle and other things which are happening. But more and more, there are other things which are coming to play today. The environmental factors have become very prominent today. And again, as I mentioned earlier, disaggregating the role of climate change from other environmental and economic factors is very difficult. We cannot put our fingers and say this is the factor, because it's one among the factors. And certainly there is a trend, there is some certain patterns we observe across the globe, which speaks for this. Thank you. Next, please. And there are limitations in the future flows. And as I mentioned earlier, the numbers are so different, produced by different agencies and organizations. But because there is a lack of baseline data there now, but slowly we're building it. The science is also improving today, and this started by population growth. I mean, there are certain populations which are very dense, and certain populations we have a tendency to migrate, and we could very well adjust to the realities, particularly the pastoral communities and other herders and stuff. They've been used for centuries. They've been doing that. They don't find many big problems. In terms of, I'm talking about the migration as such, but there are other problems. Wherever they are migrating to, probably again there is a resource dwindling there, or resource crunch in those areas where traditionally they were migrating. So there are certain limitations there. Ever increasing emissions as well contributes to the other factors, as you know, because the temperature raises and stuff, the underlying factors, the basic factors, the increasing emission. It's an universally accepted fact, and uncertainty associated with climate change. As they say, the only certain thing about climate change is the uncertainty. And so we have to live with this fact, and we have to convert this uncertainty to risk, to plan well, to understand well. Next, please. So coming to migration, there are movement predominantly is local. We see, though we talk about international migrations and stuff, what we're witnessing in Africa, in Afghanistan today, it's more of a conflict induced by, migration today. But then there are, it is very predominantly local, particularly from rural areas to urban areas. That has been the pattern for centuries, that's been happening. And people tend to move into surrounding areas, wherever the spatial distribution is influenced by a variety of factors like, social networks, the strength of the social networks, the support systems which are there in place, as well as the emergency preparedness and early warning systems. This pretty much dictate the patterns of migration today. And duration of typically temporary, mostly it's temporary, because the duration of the movement is often temporary, barring extraordinary cases. For example, Nepal, in the recent earthquake, about 390,000 people moved outside Kathmandu and other surrounding areas, but most of them returned within 2-3 months' time. So it's whatever the intensity of it, mostly people don't want to kind of, leave their, cultural roots and other things, which are embedded in the system. So it's very difficult. And so people tend to come back mostly. Next, please. So other examples, the scale of even the terms and rates of return were differentiated depending on the livelihood of the impacted households. Now, for example, during the cyclone Ayla in 2009 in Bangladesh, because of post-cyclone saline water intrusion, it has affected their cultivable lands to a larger extent. It has made extensive damage to the cultivable lands. So people couldn't use, even if they come back, they cannot use the land. So it takes some time, to kind of use those measures, adaptation measures, to rebuild it. So it took almost 2 years for them to come back. So there are different periods of time depending on the intensity of the impacts of the environmental, events you see there. That pretty much dictates the period of return. And again, another example, maybe induced migration, where you see slow onset events. Again, as I talked about, particularly droughts may persist for a longer period of time. It's not like, floods and stuff where there are enough measures, people immediately attend to those things and try to rebuild the geographies and the spaces where people are living. And so it's easier. And also the resource flow is far more in a major disaster events, unlike these low onset events. So even the own governments don't recognize that until it hits a threshold level. So that's a regular pattern what you see there. Next, please. So again, adaptation as a solution. This is a very it's a big dilemma here. There are certain theories talking migration as an adaptation option. People tend to use adaptation as an option. Migration as an adaptation option to move from one place to other place. Because oftentimes these, as I mentioned earlier, the migration is triggered by crop failures, water stress, seawater intrusion, loss of habitats. There are loss of livelihoods. There are many reasons, but people kind of project it in the light that it might also help to regenerate the environment and the natural resources in some way when people move, the extraction of resources, which we have witnessed during COVID in many of the places, during the lockdown period. But again, it is a temporary solution. It's not really, that you see a lot of biodiversity coming back, and lots of animals and microorganisms, and there are good examples of it. I myself live in a IIT Indian Institute of Technology campus in Chennai, Madras. It's a nice campus which has lots of deers and stuff. We have seen the deer population go up because of the lockdown for about a year or so. And so that is they're there to witness. But these are all temporary. Again, when people try to compensate for the loss what they had when the full-fledged operation started, the industrial operation started, then again it leads to pollution and other cascade of problems. So that is not a permanent solution, but then people also migrate to a certain level because of those, and also more importantly, remittances act as a coping mechanism through consumption soothing effects it has on the economy, the local economy. So that is another reason people go back and try to kind of generate some money and then rebuild their own places to get back. So that is an adaptation, seen as an adaptation option. Whereas there are certain questions, lingering questions about whether migration happens as a result of failure to implement, being proactive, not being proactive, results in migration as well. If there are sound policies to tackle it, nipping it to the bud, then there is a chance of survival at the same place. So there are different theories about it. I just want to kind of flag those things for people to understand. Next, please. Next slide, please. Again, when you talk about adaptation, it is a function, and adaptive capacity is a very critical component. It is a function of many things: the technology, the finance, and more importantly, the social capital. National and individual wealth is one clear determinant of vulnerability. More the GDP, more the kind of economic growth, then you see people, not that they are not affected by climate change, they are not vulnerable or so, but they have the capacity to handle that. So adaptive capacity becomes a very important component. This is one example we see where Bangladesh and the United States, where a slightly kind of outdated 91 and 92, where these two cyclones happened, major events happened in Bangladesh. Then see the amount of lives lost there. 138,000 people lives have been lost, and 10 million people rendered homeless during that period. More or less, the intensity of the storm is the same, 260, and here it is 280 kilometers per hour. And when you compare to the Hurricane Andrew, so then again the number of deaths is mere compared to what you see there, 138,000 versus 65 deaths compared to the same, more or less the same intensity of event. So that is purely one could attribute to the capacities to handle those, the financial capacities, the technological inputs what they have, and all the other things as well. And again, we see a trend, even in the developed countries, they cannot cope up with the kind of rapid things what's happening today. Recently in Germany and Belgium, see, and these are countries which have never lost lives because of any extreme events. But today we saw, in the recent past, very recently, 2 months back, there are life losses. And again, in the case of Katrina as well, we saw how people were stranded because, because of the intensity and things. And also there should be some coordinated effort to really handle this phenomenon in a very effective way. Both policy and practice should come into play. Best practices have to be really documented, and we need to learn from the mistakes, from the events. Next, please. And moving back to India, where I come from, in India, there are two major events, which has been much talked about in terms of which has created mass internal displacement. One is tsunami post 2004, and then the recent COVID pandemic in 2020. You have read in the reports, how the migrants are suffering, without any proper plan in process. They've been stranded. People are forced to walk to many miles, without any, because the lockdown was announced without any prior planning and stuff. So that has its own consequences. Post-tsunami, about 650,000 people moved, rehabilitated to new places and stuff, which is a massive movement. And again, is also triggered by natural disasters. And of course, tsunami doesn't have any connection with climate change, but those events are eye-openers for us. Certainly curtain raises for what is to come in future, definitely. And India's disaster management acts as the basis for emergency measures. After the tsunami, there are lots of changes which happened internally in terms of tinkering the policies, which cater to the needs of the poor and people who are vulnerable, who are put in the vulnerable geographies. A lot of changes came in. But it is the important lesson is we have to strengthen the policies and institutional frameworks for managing migrants and IDPs. Next, please. So this is from the lessons from the pandemic. As I mentioned, these are the very vulnerable people, particularly people who have been engaged in the informal sector. People migrating from one state to the other state have difficulties. The prosperous states, particularly the poor states to the prosperous states, they've borne the brunt of this whole, COVID, post-COVID, economic impacts to a large extent. Not only in India, again, see 75% in Saudi Arabia, because it's also populated by migrants from South Asia largely. And so it has a direct impact on them as well. And 95% in Singapore as well, surprisingly, of all new cases are among migrants, at least in the initial stages, when people are still trying to understand what COVID is all about. There's the early stages. At least, it is after that, they could understand in a better way. They could handle during the second wave things that are slightly different in terms of putting place. Not in India, of course, we have lost many lives in the second wave because of various reasons. So lockdowns have also, certainly taught us many lessons, particularly between April, May, and 2020. About 22 million jobs we lost in India. Over 78% were daily wage earners, and they're subjected to many miseries, even for one square meal, they were struggling. And of course, that is where things have come handy. Also, on the other extreme, the social capital is also coming into play. The social media is very effective in terms of, helping the migrants to a large extent today. So there are so many lessons to learn from these episodes. That's the message what I want to kind of drive here. They lack access to correct information. The information flow should be very smooth for people to kind of even understand where the food is available, what kind of social assistance is available, what kind of state-aided policies are there to help them out. That information flow should be smooth for people to even get the access to it. So yeah, it's more of an access problem as well. Next, please. So now moving on to the core element of social protection. Access to social protection is key to maintaining adequate standards of living throughout the life cycle. It doesn't stop, because we never know when you might be needing it, because it's across the life cycle, one has to ensure that there is a social protection. That is the duty of the state to do that. Of course, as citizens, we have certain responsibilities as well. Not that, we kind of put everything on the state, but state is the leader in this process, and they have to really ensure that. Migrants are poorly served by social protection systems. Largely across the globe, we see this pattern. As I mentioned, COVID has thoroughly exposed the lacunas, the weaknesses, and the weaker links in social protection systems. And also, it is very much tied to the rights of people who relocate more for short periods of seasonal migration. Generally is circumscribed because access to these people are very, very limited to all the minimum services. It's very limited because lack of education sometimes, lack of information flow, and lack of access to credits and other things, that has to be really looked into. And also the procedures underlying these processes are very, very cumbersome. Many of them are illiterate, in this digital world. How do they survive? That is a big question, very complex for them to access. Even the resources are available. It's a question of accessing them. They need to be assisted by people, who are literate to kind of, have a hold on these things. So that is more and more at one stage, we're talking about what one level, we are so proud of the digitalization processes, but unless, the literacy rates goes up and people have the ability to access these things and use those digital, systems, it is going to really create more misery. So it's important for the governments to pay attention to these processes. It is part and parcel of the social protection safety nets programs, how you design. This is also an important element. And claiming benefits is often complex. We have to will be running from pillar to post. How the government system operates. Things are improving. I'm not totally pessimistic about it, but still, the long way to go, particularly in times of crisis, like distress migration and things. It is important to be flexible about what you deliver and how you deliver. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, some general observations on the table here, and vastly undeserved by social protection, underserved by social protection systems. Migrants are the least people who have the best access to all the amenities, because of the nature of their mobility, and they don't have these domicile rights, what they call as they are not, in a specific geography where they could claim, and they are not registered in certain format to have the access to these things. There are certain big administrative barriers, as I mentioned earlier. So they don't even know their entitlements in the first place. That's another thing. So we need more and more a coherent policy framework to address this. In different societies, different vulnerability communities might need different kinds of help. So that has to be factored in when you design these programs. Next, please. So this again, I mentioned it earlier, there are certain direct impacts and indirect impacts. Lack of, for example, the challenges faced by migrants, lack of decent work and employment opportunities, timely opportunities, that's another thing, and right people at the right time also is important. But in the migrants' case, it's not possible because it's all mostly distress related, so they cannot really define their own migration patterns. It happens momentarily, it happens, within the short period of time. To accommodate everybody in every sense is going to be difficult. Disrupted social networks, again, they cannot even fall back on their own traditional social networks because everybody is affected there. And weakened rights and governance systems also contribute to this process. And rise in intercommunity conflicts and violence, that leads, I'll come back to that question. Oftentimes, the migrants also get into this kind of, quagmire, and, there are several difficulties they face on top of the push factors, which have forced them to migrate. When a new place, new geography, there are new challenges, new problems. Particularly when you come to a urban setup, mostly they settle in very impoverished kind of geographies where there are not many good amenities. One of your friend is there already, was migrated. You hear by hearsay, that this is the place for us. So that's how, and also the urban settlement, outskirts, mostly where there are not much of amenities. And the slum areas, which is getting denser and denser, and it leads to other problems, like sometimes conflicts, sometimes the hygiene issues are there. There are other diseases, endemic diseases and other things. So that's what we mean by increased exposure to environmental and climate risks, as well as health hazards. So, again, the other factors, increasing pressure on urban infrastructure, as I mentioned, more and more. One of the advantages of the recently urbanizing societies is that we could learn from the mistakes what the other societies have created and try to kind of accommodate those things in their design of the urban patterns and urban settlement planning processes. But does it happen really? That's a big question. And it also destabilizes economic growth, and we can, as I talked about, the health aspects of it. So it also leads to conflicts. Next, please. It's a huge topic. We can't cover everything, but then I'm just giving a kind of a flavor of those things. What are the critical issues which we have to deal with? And more and more people talk about the adaptive social protection today measures, and it is very context driven, and the response measures are very context specific, and we need to have a very comprehensive approach for which it should be evidence based. Unless you have the good evidence, we cannot really design, and a good science leads to good policy, as they say. So it's important to understand the realities of the people, hearing from them, their own perspective, and the people who've been affected by this thing. So that, I'm glad that you brought a person who could talk from the local government's perspective. My previous speaker spoke about it because she could understand, because the proximities to the happenings, where they are living, provides a good perspective, a very good view of what is needed. So that perspective have to be, integrated into social protection programs as well, so that it will pay more dividends to the people who deserve, and it should be flexible, practical, and it should be accessible, whatever the design we have. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Moving on to this, what are the constituents of social protection solutions? And so particularly looking from the climate lens, it could be divided into three, normal and the development scenario. How we understand social protection is subsidies, cash transfers. We have seen that time and again. And it has certain level of benefits. It has really helped. Again, it is very context specific. What works in one country might not be the same thing for other country, even within a country for that matter, because the culture and other things also matter here. And the kind of social system what we have pretty much dictates how you design the social protection system. An employment guarantee scheme, I'll come back to that, how in India particularly, this is one of the success stories. I'll come back to that. And universal distribution programs, that is also, I'll reflect a little later. These are the typical social protection systems you see anywhere. In addition, you have the education and health other services as well. And in a typical disaster risk reduction scenarios, we have the insurance coming into play and technical assistance and hard solutions like resilient housing, improved drainage, water conservation, etc., come into play. And we have, because of the consecutively being impounded with these things, we have somewhat understood this effect more, and we are very tuned to this kind of a social protection program today. I would say it's far matured compared to other social protection programs. Because over a period of time, we understood what is the need of the hour, and also there are a lot of money inflow as well, resource inflow in a disaster scenario. And climate change adaptation scenario is, again, it's a mixed kind of bag, because some of them are slow onset events. What you consider as adaptation today might not be an adaptation tomorrow, in the near future, in the long run. So it becomes a maladaptation. How do you accommodate those things within the social protection programs? There are trade-offs between short-term and long-term planning processes. So people generally go for additional or alternate livelihoods as an adaptation solution. And who pays for it? How do you calculate the adaptation costs? There are no clear definitions of it. It is all still in the air, and that's an important area to focus on. And particularly the social capital, the role of social capital is also not very much captured into the equation. So planned relocation is also considered as an adaptation. We're also making some headway there, particularly in the island states and stuff, but it is a long way to go. Next, please. A couple of more slides. Just, I don't want to kind of go on and on, but at least I thought I should cover some of the important, at least flag that if we're not having any big solutions, at least we should understand the problems first to understand it, put it in a better light, so that we could design better solutions. So social protection measures in India, there are a variety of, as I told you earlier, certainly COVID is an eye-opener for us to understand. There are several weaker linkages here. One of the celebrated programs is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. About it covers 140 million households with approximately $11 billion. It guarantees about 100 days of work, minimum 100 days of work for the rural folks in India, and with about 250 permissible work streams falling under that scheme. Most of them, about 184 of them, speaks for adaptation. These are adaptation-related work, maybe road building, rural road development, afforestation, reforestation, water conservation, water and slopy land treatments, a variety of, agroforestry, there are a variety of works. Certainly, it will strengthen in the long run. It is going to have an impact on the resilience of the geographies, different geographies in India. And of course, we are also in the social protection context. What is important, one of the missing links there, and people have been much talking about it now today, about the urban, similar program for an urban employment guarantee scheme, because that is an important thing. We have understood the realities today and how important it is to come out with some scheme which addresses the, which caters to the urban employment needs and the migrants particularly. So that much talked about, and government is also considering over that, mulling over this kind of program, which would be a big boon, certainly. And again, another important lessons, what we learned during the COVID is because of the whatever we get, India is very good at the public, at least few states, a very strong public distribution system. The rations, what we get as an entitlement, the poor vulnerable people get this on a monthly basis. But what happens, they're tied up to a particular domicile. So it is very important that when they move, they're not entitled. They lose this opportunity to take advantage of this distribution systems, the rations, particularly the food and other commodities which they have access to. So more and more people are talking about the universal public distribution system. We have a good network of distribution system here in India, but how do you kind of extrapolate it so that it serves, universally, so that people, irrespective of where they are, they could still have access to this basic, social protection measures. I mean, that's been talked about. And again, health insurance schemes. There are many good schemes which have come out. Its portability is there, so they could, attend to their health needs irrespective of where they are. Cash transfer and access to credit are much talked about. It's the very, traditional way of doing social protection measures, which has been embedded in the system for a longer time, which has some success as well. And enhanced access to common property resources. We have to also revive those things so that people could make use of it. There are age-old days where people have been dependent on this. With our rapid urbanization taking place, this has been really affected in a very big way. How do you kind of revive those things, revitalize those things is also an important part of parcel of social protection measures. And leveraging local community-based institutions. There are women self-help groups, which there's one thing to kind of have this established, all these resources established. How do you generate a market? How do you generate income out of it? How do you market those products and stuff coming out of those things? Again, we need to really be very innovative about, and particularly today, social entrepreneurship is gaining a lot of ground, with startups and other things. It is important to kind of, bring those private sector angle to this whole, because it's dominated by the public resources and public thought, particularly social protection measures. So it's important for the other segment of people to come into, more and more we are entering to that stream now today to think of innovative ways to include them in this process. Next, please. Next slide, please. So there are certain global examples as well. I don't want to dwell too much into this. A confluence of factors leads World Bank. One of the World Bank studies shows that Bangladesh, Bhutan, and India, and Maldives, and Nepal will lose 1.8% of its annual GDP due to climate change and migration by 2050. That is enormous. And there are transboundary conflicts which might happen as well. And one of the things, very well documented one in Syria, how today the terrorism and other things, what you find there are largely because, again, we cannot authentically say that. There are pointers to that. I don't want to get into this controversy. There are people, there are different theories about it, but there are certain indications that, it will push you to other, civic unrest is something which is very common, when you have misery and, vulnerabilities. That is always often, history has shown that. So there are endangered islands today. We talked about endangered species, but today in Maldives and, other places we see fast disappearing. So how do you kind of manage those things? Unless we are very proactive about it. Next, please. Across the globe, you see these kind of patterns. And so in Pacific Islands, particularly, there are laws of many islands today, and how the neighboring countries are helping out, and what kind of investment should they make? So these are some of the questions. These are the transboundary issues. How do they help? Are they willing to help at all? What kind of? That's why the regional, arrangements are very, very important to kind of negotiate these processes. There are good examples. New Zealand and Australia are willing to do that, but at what scale? That's another question. About 2,000 is not a big deal, but still, the 2,000 people are catered to. But at least there are some good examples what you see there. So it will reduce the vulnerabilities household, and they are preparing them to kind of place them in a better position post all this climate events that's happening. So there are certain good examples people should try to emulate. And again, there is no one size fits all kind of a thing. These social protection measures have to be tailor made to the geographies, to the history, their entry points. Because when you talk about this, the historical things, the matter, people's culture matter, because they may not be. It's not for them. It's not easy to switch over overnight to the new realities of life. So next, please. Probably this is the last one, I guess. Next, please. The key messages. Again, there are fundamental messages. No one should be left behind. Oftentimes you see this among the vulnerable people, again, the disabled and the old people, the bad, the brunt, they cannot move and they have to suffer the losses, whatever. The livelihoods are really, taken away, and they suffer to a large extent. So this would require making social protection systems more sensitive to the needs of the excluded population groups, which I talked about earlier, and recognizing the various types of vulnerabilities. Different geographies have different vulnerabilities. For example, if you're talking about a coastal area, the agriculture in coastal areas are affected, the fishermen's community or fisher folks are affected in different ways. What are the kind of social protection measures? What have to be tailored to their needs is more important. Next, please. So this is a continuing slide again, way forward, talking about a few things, identifying high climate vulnerable communities at the subnational local levels, because where the problem starts, because people are exposed to different degrees and different level of, depending on their adaptive capacity, they're placed different ways. So it is important to understand those vulnerabilities, who is affected in what ways, that's the question. And planning a structured approach to enhancing their adaptive capacity, like skill building, vocational training, language tutorials. So that's far more important. When people migrate, it often seems in India, a diverse country like India, we face this. People come from different places. Every province has its own language. So communication becomes a typical thing. Now, when you're prepared to migrate, you should understand the language as well. At least the basic, day-to-day operations, they need the basic language skill sets. So that is important. And information campaign and entitlements. People should understand what they're entitled to. So that is important to the government side for all the agencies to kind of focus on these issues. And designing viable adaptive protection measures, which I talked about earlier, so I'm not going to dwell into that. And understanding the required policy levers, where are the levers, and financial support, especially for the special targeted groups, especially. Next, please. Slide. Next, please. Coordinate.
Dr. Apaduray.
That's the last slide.
Okay.
Yeah, this list. A coordinated policy framework, strengthening administrative capacities, institutional is very, very critical, and financing mechanisms, what way to generate funds, either multilateral or bilateral. I'll stop here. That's about it. Thank you very much for listening to me. Sorry, I thought I should give a really panoramic view rather than dwelling deep into that. And it's probably exceeded my time a little bit. Hope you don't mind. Thanks.